Hi, everyone.
And we're super excited today to do this virtual monthly event. And we're very grateful and thankful to Branch Pattern, who's sponsoring today's event. And also, we do not have it on a slide, I believe, but Evergy is sponsoring this whole series. So we're very grateful to have those folks supporting this opportunity so we can make this free for all of you. It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you Trevor Cohen. Trevor is an environmental author and an educator, and he travels around the country to chronicle a renaissance in empowering communities and healing the planet. And his book, Bright Green Future, brings together stories of innovators and activists who are building the foundation of a sustainable society. And the readers of this great book will learn what symbiotic relationships can teach us about switching to renewables, how ecosystems can guide the next industrial revolution, and how the hidden genius of rainforest and prairies can help us grow food in a warming world. And so it is my extreme pleasure and honor to introduce you to Trevor Cohen.
Well, thank you so much for that, Laura. That's a really kind introduction. It's really nice to be here and really honored to be speaking with all of you wonderful educators, and good to see you, Leslie, as well, and representing Missouri and the Educational Association there. And yeah, I've been blown away really with the level of quality of programming that you all put together at KC, and the level of detail in all of your courses. And I actually got to take a few of your courses recently and go through them, and it was just really, really cool what you all put together. And also the written material that came with it was really, really appreciated and cool. So I'm going to just share my screen with you all here. So yeah, my name is Trevor. As Laura mentioned from the introduction, I have spent the last 5 years traveling the country, and I interview innovators and activists who are working to build the foundation for a sustainable society. I came from a place of just in several years ago in my mid-20s, feeling really discouraged about the pace of change that was needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change, and just feeling overwhelmed about what can actually be done about climate change, and really being saturated in the news with all of the fearful and terrifying stuff that we're up against. And that's not even talking about the challenges of actually making any change throughout our cultural, economic, and political systems in order to avoid the worst effects of what's happening. And through a serendipitous relationship with a professor of environmental studies who happened to be my roommate at the time, we collaborated to basically look at what's actually being done to not just avoid the worst effects of climate change, but to create a better world at the same time. And so we traveled the country and we interviewed over 200 people who are in there working on community-centered solutions to climate change, really working and looking at the challenges as well as resources and strengths in their various communities to create solutions that are reflective of what their communities need, what their hopes and dreams and aspirations are. And we combined all those different stories into this book, Bright Green Future, which chronicles across energy, industry, cities, and farms, these many different areas. How do we create the world we actually want to live in, rather than getting bogged down in the fear and the dread around the world that that will happen if we don't do something about changing our relationship with the planet. And so a part of our intention with this book was also to provide the next generation and students with a way to see what is the possible world we might create, and who's actually creating it right now, just beyond words around aspirations, also like who's actually working on it on the ground right now. and we really focused on concrete examples from various different communities, from urban to rural to suburban and across a wide sector of the United States, to show what solutions can look like, in your town, if whether or not you live in a big city, or you live out in the country, or you live in the suburbs, to see what these various solutions look like, so that the next generation doesn't feel extremely overwhelmed. Obviously, it's an overwhelming challenge, but is able to see what is possible. So not just getting bogged down in the fear and feeling like everything is all on our shoulders. And so a big part of this big part of this process of envisioning a sustainable society and looking at what can be done is really how we conceptualize and how we think about the problem, and what are the principles that we use to addressing it. And a lot of us grew up with kind of, or at least I remember, recycle, reduce, reuse being some of the core principles of sustainability that I learned in school. And they often had to do with an admittedly smaller challenge of just looking at waste as being the challenge that we faced. And now those challenges have ballooned to be focused on climate change, species extinction, major ecological collapse, huge temperature changes, and sea level rise. Like there's so many more challenges that are coming to the fore now. And so I think it's important to think about, like, what are the principles we're using to address the challenge in front of us. And so I wanted to ask you all a question to learn from. I mean, I love doing this because I learn a lot from folks across the country and educators and activists about what you think are some of the key types of thinking that the next generation will need in order to create a sustainable society and break free from our fossil fueled economy. So if you're all welcome to put your responses in the chat, and I'll go through them all with the group. So yeah, what types of thinking do you feel we'll need in order to create a sustainable society? Okay, Ashlyn says creative thinking. Yes, that's extremely important in order to move forward and think about, like, what we can create rather than solely getting stuck in the despair of what's being destroyed. So yeah, reframing that towards creativity rather than solely on the destructive aspect. Jeff says systems thinking. Yes, that's extremely important, of thinking holistically. Climate change is the ultimate multi-system problem affecting ecological systems, climate systems, political, economic, cultural systems, systems of knowledge. Yeah, really love that. That's extremely important. Lenfield says, how to work with what you have. Yes, also looking at the resources we have available, the unique wisdom within our communities, and working within the bounds of what is not taking too much from the planet, that it becomes irreparably damaged, or unable to continuously provide the resources we need to sustain ourselves. So that is very important. Jamin or Jameen says, scientific evidence-based information to guide us. Yes, yeah, combining both the best knowledge that we have from observational empirical evidence from science with creative thinking and solutioning is like two of the most powerful tools we have for developing solutions. So yeah, supercharging those two elements together is extremely important. Thank you for bringing that up. C. Morrison says, small changes can add up to make big changes. Yeah, this is also an important realization because the scope of the problem we have is so large, and we do have to break it down into its smaller pieces when we address it, thinking systemically about the big picture, but also thinking about how smaller actions can often have ripple effects and either energize other actions, encourage other people to do things, as well as have other kind of positive externalities. We talk about negative externalities a lot in environmental pollution, but small positive actions can have their own kind of positive ripple effects from them. Delaney says, thinking outside of the quote unquote norm. Yes, like a lot of these different things mentioned are like challenging us to think outside of the norm of what we assume is possible, because when we get stuck in solely this assumption land of what we can and can't do, then that's when we become limited by what future we can actually create. So busting outside of the norm and thinking creatively and just, even if it's a bizarre thing and, doesn't necessarily work out, just challenging ourselves to break out of the norm is really important. Pam says critical thinking. Yeah, I think that's definitely a broad thing that is important for everything. In thinking about, I think I like to think of critical thinking in the sense of not being too hard on ourselves if we're wrong about something, and being okay, being critical of our own thinking, and being okay being wrong about things, because ultimately, like, that's what we need in order to make the right choices for the future, is to be comfortable with being wrong, so we find the right thing and constantly challenging ourselves to think more deeply. So thank you, Pam, for that. And Leslie, I'm going to go through a couple more and then jump into the presentation. Thank you all for every one of you who've written in. Leslie says, shift to reciprocity and abundance from survival of fittest / scarcity. Yes, I 100% agree with that. And that is also a good tie-in to like busting out of the norm, where a lot of the kind of mainstream thinking is oftentimes like, anything that's good for the planet comes at a sacrifice to our own quality of life as humans, or anything that's good for humans comes at a sacrifice to the natural world. And so moving away from this kind of zero-sum game of it's either nature or us, towards a abundance of like, how do we align our human economies in modern world with the well-being of the natural systems around us, and challenging ourselves to have that more kind of abundance mindset, because that's not mindset, but the way that nature works in providing for countless populations and species, almost effortlessly. Like nature transfers more energy than all human industrial systems combined, and there is really an abundance within that system. And there's some stat, like, I don't know the exact number, but more energy falls on the sun like every second than is needed to power all human industry for an entire year. So I'm probably messing that up, but somewhere along those lines. I'm just going to read one more from, let's see if there's anyone else new. Oh, we got a love from Laura. I'm going to read one more from Pam, is combining environmental and social justice. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for adding that to the discussion, because it is really important to be not just thinking about how do we do things for the planet to create a more healthy planet, but how do we create a healthy communities, and how do we create a more equitable society at the same time, so that the folks who have suffered most from our extractive and fossil fuel based economies are part of and are leaders in the vision for the future world that we can create together. and focusing on economic development. And that's something I really tried to focus on in Bright Green Future, was kind of that nexus of economic development, climate change mitigation, as well as social justice and climate justice, and really kind of uniting those two, because as I said earlier, it is the ultimate multi-systems problem. It involves human systems, natural systems, climate systems. So thank you all for your awesome contributions. I really learn a lot every time I ask this question, and clearly a lot of you have, as educators, have thought really deeply about this, which really does give me a lot of hope for the future, if our educators are thinking this deeply about the type of thinking we need for the next generation, that we can inspire and equip that generation to rise to the occasion. And so I wanted to share with you all, in the course of interviewing folks for this book, 3 different types or kind of ways of reframing the principles to create a sustainable society in the spirit of the 3 R's of recycle, reduce, reuse. I wanted to introduce 3 other R's for climate solutionaries. And these are really thinking more broadly about not just waste, but the huge changes that have to happen in order to create a sustainable future. These 3 R's are rethink, rethinking our assumptions about how we design our modern world, which is looking a little bit more deeply than what we see at the surface level, and being able to bust out of the norm and see things holistically, in order to design and think and reimagine things and create more creative solutions. Second R is reconnect. So reconnect with both community and nature, so that both the people and the natural world around us, both of those are key components. Like we can't just focus on our relationship with nature without focusing on the relationship with the people around us, because we're all part of this together, and kind of tying the well-being of both of these, I think is extremely crucial towards creating a better future where we're no longer in this kind of zero-sum game. And then thirdly is regenerate, which is all about how do we create both human economies and natural ecologies that grow stronger and healthier over time, that rather than degrade with each passing season, become more resilient in times of crisis, as well as better able to benefit from times of prosperity. And so thinking, kind of drawing on that wisdom of nature in our human economy to think, and within our communities, within our industrial systems, within the way we steward the land, thinking about regeneration in that sense, and bringing that sense of regeneration that exists in nature into our human economy, so that we're also, that human economy is allowing for the regeneration of natural ecologies. So I'm going to go into these 3 different types of thinking, or these kind of 3 new principles, and show us concrete examples from across the country of what they look like in action. So rethink, a big part of rethinking is taking a step back. And one of you mentioned systems thinking. That is a very big part of how we rethink, of taking that step back and looking beyond just like all of the problems in isolation, and looking at how multiple things are interconnected with each other, how things are, rather than solely linear, going from point A to point B, how things are circular, where point B is the beginning of a new point A in a kind of a circular rhythm, and looking at things as not solely separate in silos, but emerging together, and seeing not just solely the parts, and rethinking kind of the getting stuck on like mired in kind of all of these parts as separate, or all these different problems we face as separate, but taking a step back and looking at the whole. So I wanted to share a story with you all, of a tech whiz and the farmer, which I think illustrates well this kind of need to rethink the norm of how we approach problem solving, kind of in the normal fashion, and what it looks like when we approach something instead with maybe more of a holistic mindset when we're rethinking that problem. So this has to do with a conversation that I had when I was in San Francisco with a serial tech startup entrepreneur and founder of upwards of 6 companies, very passionate about climate change and doing something to create a better future for people and planet. But during that conversation, regenerative farming came up, kind of farming that works to build soil and build carbon into the soil. And during our conversation, he made the point that regenerative organic farming is pointless. There's no reason we should be spending time doing it. If we really wanted to sequester carbon, we could do it more efficiently by just putting a giant carbon capture machine on the land, kind of this giant kind of fan system, rather than putting a regenerative organic farm on that land. And we could sequester, X times more carbon by doing that. Of course, he was right if we were to approach the problem from a traditional perspective of just focusing on one metric or one thing or maximizing one thing. But if we look at the benefits that come from an organic farm or a regenerative organic farm, we find that the only benefits from that carbon capture machine are sequestering carbon, where a farm, that's building healthy soil might sequester less carbon, than a carbon capture machine, but at the same time is also growing healthy food. It's providing a better water capture and water retention in times of rain and flood. It's holding more water during times of drought, almost working as kind of a flood management system or drought management system. And also in many farms that are kind of community oriented, also providing an introduction for people in the community to connect with the food system that sustains us and have a deeper relationship that is often lost in kind of city settings around what is actually supporting and sustaining us, and what's its relationship. Like what is our impact on the land, and how is that land sustaining us to grow the foods that are the foundation of life, human life. And so we start to see in rethinking this problem of just sequestering carbon and really focusing on just like that's the only benefit we want to get. We start to see, by taking a step back and rethinking it, we can create all of these other benefits that come up when we look more holistically at the various systems of that are part of a carbon sequestering solution that can be impacted. Not just thinking how do we sequester the most carbon, but if we're going to sequester carbon, what are all the other things, benefits we can stack on top of that through the solutions we have. When we take a step back and looking at our cities and farms kind of in the mainstream as a whole, they often resemble monocultures because in our cities, we maximize one thing in each area. We'll maximize residential and housing in one area. We'll maximize commerce in another with big strip malls and shopping centers. And we do the same thing on our farms, where we maximize production of soybean in one area, corn in another, livestock in a completely separate area, not thinking about all of the benefits that come from integrating a nutrient cycle together and rethinking production as the nutrient cycle that's part of that production, when various crops are mixed, and kind of the benefits of legumes sequestering carbon with that, legumes fixing nitrogen. That was a faux pas. Fixing nitrogen in the soil to help grow other crops, as well as animals more integrated with farms and being part of that nutrient cycle. The same thing in our cities, the kind of intangible range of benefits that come from a vibrant community that is mixing many different types of uses, from living, playing, and working, and having neighborhoods where we can walk to the things we like to do, have all of these other kind of benefits that come out of them if we were just focusing on maximizing one thing at a time: housing, commerce, and so on. So I wanted to show you all an example of what it looks like to mix these various different things, what a holistic design looks like to rethink our cities and farms. So this is an example of a community in Gilbert, Arizona, that was really was a family farm for many different years. And this is kind of a typical story across many suburbs in the US, especially over the last 100 years, where developers will buy up large farms and convert them into residential subdivisions. And this was an example just like that, where the Johnston family farm had been there for years, and a developer reached out and wanted to buy their land. And while they started talking to them, they wanted to do something different. They wanted to preserve that sense of community that exists in smaller towns in the United States. And so they decided to create something new rather than just a standard residential subdivision. They combined a mixed-use neighborhood around an organic farm, where residents in the area can access the fresh produce. They converted the old farmhouse into a restaurant. Kind of the downstairs dining area became space for tables. The kitchen became the kitchen for the restaurant. They converted bedrooms into additional dining seating. They converted this old cylindrical metal tractor shed into a place for new businesses to get started. There's a brewery in there. There's several different craft makers, a co-working space, places for people to start new businesses. They started a coffee shop. And they also tried to, in the housing, mix multiple different types of housing. So not just how do we create a neighborhood for young college students who've just graduated, or for families with young kids, or for folks who are retiring, but how do we mix all of these different phases of life into one neighborhood, and so they combine multi-family housing with single-family housing, a senior living facility, a school, to really mix different types of income, different types of periods in our lives into this community to create these kind of more meaningful, these various connections that sometimes get lost in more single purpose neighborhoods. And in doing so, they created all of these other benefits that often, if they just focused on one thing, wouldn't have come about. They created a destination in the neighborhood where people come on the weekends to visit the craft makers, to go out to eat, to visit the coffee shop. People have weddings on the farm. It's an event space, in addition to providing food for the restaurant, as well as different people in the community. And in doing so, yeah, they created all of these really interesting benefits that wouldn't have come about if they just really focused on one thing. And so it's one example of the power of kind of rethinking the problem with a new mindset around holistic design and systems thinking throughout our cities and farms. Breaking down those barriers too between cities and farms is, okay, these are separate things and they require separate solutions, kind of busting out of that norm thinking around that. So secondly, reconnect, or second R, which is reconnect can be in many, many different ways, because part of this challenge we face is reconnecting with the natural world and the way it sustains us, as well as reconnecting with our fellow humans that are part of this multi-generational relay race to heal the planet and empower our communities. And so I like to think of reconnection in both that sense of reconnecting with our communities and what our communities actually need, and what are our hopes and dreams and visions for the future, as well as how do those dreams and visions affect the natural world, and how can they be in alignment? Kind of reconnection in two senses there. So a big part of this is reconnecting the benefits of change to communities. You know, we obviously have to make a lot of changes in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And so we might as well have the beneficiaries of that change being our own local communities, and bringing it back home. Obviously, with the centralized fossil fuels, we all benefit from being able to drive and being able to have affordable access in some sense to electricity. But the majority of beneficiaries from the revenue generated for the fossil fuel industry is fossil fuel companies and utilities. And the people who happen to live next to these polluting facilities have to deal with the externalities of them, and do not share in the wealth generated in the local areas where this power is created or where it's mined, to the same extent as kind of the primary owners of these different companies and utilities. And we're starting to see, as with distributed renewables, the ability to create many different models for expanding the beneficiaries to more people, and to the local community. I know potentially in where you all live in Kansas and Missouri and other rural parts of America, there are a lot of rural electric co-ops, which do have kind of a local, to some extent, local community stakeholders in the ownership and stewarding of the local electrical utility and kind of grid system and power generation system. In California, we're starting to see a rise of a new way that people are, cities and towns are coming together to start these community choice energy providers, where cities and towns can decide what type of energy they want, how it's sourced, as well as how to spend the extra revenue that's generated from that electricity, whether it goes to local projects, whether it goes specifically in prioritizing hiring local people, creating job training programs, and throughout the state. While this started as really just one community moving towards 100% renewables through the choosing where their power comes from, now upwards of 50% of the state are, and 19 of these separate organizations, community choice providers, now provide energy for the grid in California. And a lot of it's really cool to see like how they're able to rather than having one giant utility, in this case Northern California Pacific Gas and Electric, being able to tailor the electrical needs of what each area needs, and also having that go back to support the local economy. And there's kind of a wide variety of new ways to shift from shared solar to different cooperatives to cooperatively owned wind farms and solar farms, to shift the beneficiaries of this new renewable economy and reconnect those benefits to our communities, rather than solely to a few owners of these larger companies. A lot of reconnection is really like reconnecting those solutions also to local needs and what's needed on the ground, as well as kind of local wisdom and visions. And this is an example of an organization in Appalachia known as Coalfield Development, in West Virginia, where a lot of the coal companies have gone into bankruptcy. A lot of people have been laid off and lost work in a place that was really dependent on one commodity, coal, as the sole driver of their economy. And so what they're doing is they've formed a number of different social enterprises to create the foundation for a renewable economy in Appalachia and a more diverse economy. They created one of the cool examples is they're transforming old surface mines, basically mountains that have been blown apart for mining coal, or kind of open pit mines, into food forests. They take a stone crusher machine and grind up the old rocks and rubble into it, and then come in with pigs and goats, and then plant cover crops and different fruit trees and nut trees, and in doing so, train folks in how to grow a profitable farm business, to create more income in a place where the majority of the revenue had come in from coal. And they've also started other different companies, including a company that makes affordable housing and trains laid off coal miners in construction. Another one, they actually acquired a sustainable manufacturer of t-shirts and apparel for Major League Baseball, that makes that apparel out of recycled plastic bottles and other recycled materials. And now they kind of brought into this warehousing space, with this warehouse that they revived, a kind of new manufacturing area that's kind of based on sustainable materials. And everyone who's part of that organization also gets a free 2 years associate's degree, as well as kind of additional skills training, to also to have really the skills to create this new sustainable economy in a place that was just really dependent on one thing. And also, they've also reconnected with what they see as Appalachian values, being key to creating a sustainable society. And these values are that are a big part of their platform is gumption, grit, and grace, which they see as folks who have made a living in the mountains for hundreds of years of really having the keys to create a sustainable society, of being able to make things really well, fix things really well, have able to try over and over again to figure something out. And so really seeing not just like, oh, we need new values, but the values for a sustainable society exist everywhere. It's just a matter of finding them and bringing them to life. Another example of both reconnecting to traditional wisdom, as well as regenerating a local economy in a sustainable way, and providing a kind of a template for, and which I'll get to a little bit more around regeneration, of thinking about what does a regenerative community look like when we reconnect with how our human world impacts the natural world around us, and how do we also reconnect with local vision. So this is a community on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. An organization got started known as Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, that began as a spiritual circle where folks were looking at they were looking at the many different challenges that they faced as a community, up to 70% unemployment, folks living on as little as $7,000 a year, and severe housing crisis where as many as 15 people were living in a 2-bedroom home in some communities. And so they looked at all of these various challenges that they were facing and reconnected with folks in their community through a series. They interviewed 3,000 people on the reservation to see like what do they want for their future, what do they want for their grandchildren's future, and how do they want to be a part of building it. And so they took that step back of rethinking the problem from a holistic perspective, as well as kind of reconnecting local visions and what people actually wanted their future into this regenerative community that they created, where they combined many different initiatives, both sustainability focus, economic development focus, cultural revitalization focus, and they built new housing by training local youth in construction, similar to how Coalfield had done things. And many of some of the construction workers and the construction trainers ended up being some of the first-time home buyers in the housing that they built. And they also built a regenerative organic farm in the middle that provides a lot of access to healthy protein through chickens that produce a lot of eggs, which they give to either folks in need or sell at gas stations or wherever people can access food in the community. And they also created a gathering space in the middle, community center, where it provides a bunch of different skills training, as well as reconnect with the Lakota language, which had been really discriminated against and suppressed for centuries, and for especially the last century, as well as different traditional practices, and really reconnecting with kind of what does an indigenous form of placemaking look like. The way they even designed the housing kind of in this circle, as well as kind of having this kind of community center in place in the middle, was based on how they used to set up their settlements on the plains. And I believe it's called Teoshpaye, in the way was kind of that name of family or community in their actual like physical design of the space. And so oftentimes when we talk about sustainable cities in the US, we look back to kind of Paris as this, or the European city as this model for the ideal kind of walkable space, and sustainable space. But there's millennia of knowledge of placemaking in North America, of how to build sustainable communities and places, and reconnecting with that kind of of that wisdom throughout the many different communities and indigenous communities throughout North America, provides a way to both rethink how we approach the problem of placemaking. And the entire place is also powered by solar energy. And so thinking about how do you grow food in a way that is not taking too much, where previously 99% of the food there had been brought in by trucks. How do you provide all the energy in that area from powered by the sun in that local area? And how do you also provide various and reconnect with kind of traditional wisdom that has existed for a long time. And so thirdly, the third R is regenerate. And regenerate can be thought in many different senses. It can often be thought of regeneration from a land perspective. So how does our interaction with the land for human needs through agriculture or various human needs, how can it make that land stronger with every passing year, and either the ecologies around that land or within that land stronger with every passing season. So this is an organization known as the Regen Ag Alliance that was started by Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin, who grew up in Guatemala as his family farmed a plot that was in the rainforest outside of town. And he was really inspired by the way that the rainforest seems to almost effortlessly provide for countless different species, with kind of seemingly without lifting a finger. And so he wanted to bring that knowledge of the rainforest into farming. And he happened to meet his wife, who's from Minnesota, when he was in his 20s, and they ended up actually moving back to Minnesota, where he's taken kind of that wisdom of the rainforest, of thinking about an acre not in solely 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions, of kind of leaves that are absorbing energy going 10 feet to 20 feet up in the air, to then roots that are digging underground to harvest different minerals and nutrients from the soil. And he combined that with chickens. So he combines fruit, nut trees, and chickens in this permaculture system along with fresh produce. And he trains migrant farm workers in just in how to start their own farm businesses. Something like 68% of all farm laborers in the US is provided by migrant farm workers. And so he's trying to provide a kind of a low barrier to entry with chickens and fruit and nut trees on, a system as small as three acres to an acre and a half to produce a lot of income with a lot less inputs for kind of smaller farmers to then kind of grow from there and kind of rethinking our agricultural system from the bottom up like that, and thinking about how do we recharge he kind of thinks of the soil kind of like a battery that is recharged by everything we put back into it, the leaf litter, the chicken manure, all the branches, everything that falls back down to the ground. He says we should be putting like 70% back into the soil so that your next cycle starts off stronger than the one before and you need less inputs. One thing he says is if you could reduce the cost of chicken and produce and the only thing you had to do was improving our ecology, would you do it? And so that's really the spirit that he's embodied in the way he's set up his farm systems and train folks in how to kind of expand that and scale that from there. We can also think of regenerating land in the sense of our materials and the materials that make up our modern economy. And so this is a startup out of British Columbia that they take old e-waste as well as lithium ion batteries, kind of this part of this cycle of gadgets. We have this kind of economic tech system that's based off of developing a gadget and then it becoming obsolete every year to 6 months. And in doing that, it creates a lot of waste that is very hard to process and often ends up in other countries, in Nigeria and Bangladesh, where oftentimes people are in unhealthy conditions sorting through our old electronics to get at the gold and the precious metals inside. And so Ronin 8 has basically, they've repurposed this old tool that used to be used to shake mine tailings, gold out of mine tailings. And it's essentially a massive tuning fork. And it uses sound energy in order to separate all of the different metals in our electronics. What they do is they grind up our old electronic devices and they use this harmonic resonance, the sound energy to separate out the fiberglass from all of the metals, and then all the metals from themselves, the copper, the tin, the silver, the lead, the gold, the palladium, all the rare earth metals that we have to currently mine, which creates a bad impact on the planet to extract those materials. And then at the back end, when we waste, when those materials end up in the trash, they end up in somebody else's backyard. And so they've developed this non-toxic process to be reimagining what does a modern economy look like that makes waste obsolete. And we should be really thinking about all of these cycles of materials in the same way that nature looks at cycling nutrients throughout ecosystems. And so if we look at and one of the things they're working on is how do we recycle lithium ion batteries and how do we recycle solar panels through this system. And so thinking about lithium ion batteries and solar panels, like we look at a plant or a tree, where at the end of a tree's life, it becomes a nurse log and provides nutrients for the next cycle of growth. We should be thinking about our old lithium ion batteries and solar panels in the same way, where they're providing the nutrients for the next cycle of energy production systems, rather than ending up as waste and we have to constantly kind of extract more from nature and then dump when it's end of its useful life somewhere else. So thinking about these various cycles of materials as nutrient cycles is extremely important. And then thirdly, regenerating people and regenerating our spirit and confidence in taking on these huge challenges that we face as a society, and both within actually specifically climate change, as well as the many other kind of intersecting challenges that we face. This is an organization known as Soulfire Farm in upstate New York that trains Black and Indigenous folks to become farmers and to regenerate the land, as well as start kind of their own community farms across the country to provide both access to healthy foods, as well as kind of an introduction to reconnect with nature and the food system that sustains us, learn new skills, and kind of also grow kind of our, as I mentioned, like our confidence and ability to stand up to these huge challenges that we face as a society. And climate change being the ultimate multi-system problem, we need multi-system solutions in order to face it. And so these different stories, these are many different stories that are within Bright Green Future, this book, that is these are kind of just a snapshot of the many ways we can rethink, reconnect, and regenerate. Rethink the problem, reconnect with our communities, and regenerate the planet, our materials, and our own human confidence to stand up to the challenges we face, because it can be overwhelming. And a good first step when things get really overwhelming is to see what is possible. And so the antidote to despair really is getting involved and finding a path to action. And that's really what my intention with this book was, to show what's possible and then provide a path to action. At the very end, I kind of provide like how do you start getting involved in your community after hearing about all these things, to think creatively and find ways to collaborate with what you have, as well as what the local values are, so that the character of the change is also reflective of the character of our communities. And that is ultimately what will be more sustainable. And in the long run, because this is not something that can be a problem that can be fixed overnight. We're in this multi-generational relay race together, and to heal the planet and our communities. And so I offer a 25% off with the discount on the book through Educators Rock. If you just go to brightgreenfuture.com. I also these are for signed copies of the book. I write a little note and I'll sign a copy for you, and just type in Educators Rock at checkout. Also, feel free to get in touch. You can reach me at trevor@brightgreenfuture.com. I do different presentations. I lead different sessions with environmental groups in various communities, bringing together both some of the solutions discussed in this presentation, along with kind of what's happening actually in your community, with the local organizations there, to kind of get folks energized and involved about being part of developing local climate solutions. And yep, I've talked to classes as well as whole schools. So yeah, really open to collaborating. And yeah, I hope you found this interesting. And yeah, would love to hear any questions you have in the chat. And yeah, thank you all.
Thanks so much, Trevor. That was amazing.
That was a lot.
Yeah.